It started like any other quiet afternoon in Cedar Park, but things took a dramatic turn when a man filming outside a public building caught the attention of a local cop. The officer, clearly unaware of the man's rights, approached him with suspicion. What started as a simple conversation quickly escalated into a heated exchange, with the officer demanding compliance and the man calmly standing his ground. The tension grew as the officer, seemingly unsure of the law, insisted on taking action. Passers-by couldn't believe what they were seeing, and the situation became more intense by the second. Why was the man being confronted for something that seemed so innocent? And what would happen next as the officer decided to take things further? Stay tuned as we break down this shocking moment and uncover the truth behind the confrontation that has everyone talking. The man, holding his camera steady, calmly asked the officer why he was being stopped. He explained he was simply recording in a public area, but the officer wasn't having it. His tone grew firmer as he insisted the man put the camera down and provide identification. Nearby onlookers started to gather, whispering among themselves, unsure of what had sparked the confrontation. What the officer didn't seem to realize was that the man knew exactly what he was doing. He had been here before, documenting his rights in public spaces to educate others about the importance of the law. The tension grew thicker as the officer appeared increasingly agitated, fumbling with his words while trying to justify his actions. Was this just a misunderstanding, or was something deeper at play? The scene had turned into a standoff, leaving everyone wondering how far the officer would take things. The officer's frustration was clear as he stepped closer, his voice stern. "You can't just stand here recording," he said, motioning toward the man's camera. But the man remained calm, keeping his tone measured. "This is public property," he replied. "I'm not breaking any laws." His confidence only seemed to irritate the officer further, who started calling for backup. The crowd grew larger, murmurs of curiosity and concern rippling through the bystanders. From a distance, an older woman watching the scene shook her head. "He's not doing anything wrong," she muttered, but no one dared step in. Meanwhile, the man behind the camera refused to budge, asking simple, clear questions that the officer struggled to answer. Was this about authority or ignorance? As the officer's backup arrived, the situation only seemed to escalate. Was the man about to be silenced for standing up for his rights? As more officers arrived on the scene, the atmosphere grew even more tense. One of them approached the first officer, quietly asking what the situation was about. "He's refusing to cooperate," the officer replied, his tone sharp. The man filming held his ground, his camera still rolling, capturing every word, every gesture. "Am I being detained?" he asked firmly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the growing crowd. It was a simple question, but one that seemed to rattle the officer even more. The backup officer glanced at the man, then back at his colleague, hesitating for a moment as if unsure how to proceed. The crowd's whispers turned to hushed gasps as the original officer suddenly stepped forward, reaching for the man's camera. "Enough of this," he said, his patience clearly gone. The man stepped back, his voice unwavering. "You're making a mistake," he warned. The tension was unbearable. What would happen next? Just as the officer reached for the camera, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a man called out. All eyes turned to him, a sharp-dressed attorney who had been watching silently from the sidelines. He stepped forward, holding up his phone, already recording. "You're on thin ice here, officer," he said calmly but firmly. The officer froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard. "This man has the right to film in public. Are you sure you want to escalate this further?" The original officer looked flustered, glancing at his colleagues for support, but even they seemed unsure now. The crowd, emboldened by the attorney's intervention, started to murmur louder, some even pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. The man with the camera remained still, watching as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. What would the officer do now? The officer hesitated, his hand hovering in midair as the weight of the moment sunk in. The attorney's words had clearly struck a chord, and the growing number of cameras aimed at him only added to the pressure. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, the officer stepped back, glaring at the man with the camera. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "But don't think this is over." The man calmly lowered his camera for a moment, nodding toward the attorney in silent thanks. Just as the crowd began to relax, thinking the confrontation was over, a high-ranking supervisor arrived on the scene. He assessed the situation quickly, listening to both sides. "Stand down," he ordered the officers, his tone firm. "This man is within his rights." But just as relief washed over the crowd, the supervisor turned to the man and said with a smirk, "By the way, you might want to check the city's ordinance on standing near restricted entrances." A subtle hint of trouble still lingered, leaving everyone wondering what might happen next. The man looked at the supervisor, a small smile forming as he replied, "I've read every ordinance. I'm not breaking any rules." The supervisor gave him a lingering glance, but eventually nodded, signaling the officers to leave. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads at how quickly things had escalated, others commending the man for standing firm. The attorney gave the man a pat on the shoulder before walking off, leaving him to finish his recording. As the scene quieted, the man turned his camera back on himself. "This is why knowing your rights is so important," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Standing up for them isn't always easy, but it matters." With that, he packed up and walked away, his calm demeanor contrasting the earlier chaos. For the audience, the moment was a reminder. Knowledge is power, and sometimes that's all it takes to change the outcome.